More people who come in. Professor Nolan has all of her notes here, I'm afraid. I can't make sense of this.
That's because I didn't actually do anything specific, so there's lots of ideas.
So I'm going to take a step away from here eventually, lest anyone think that I will be giving this talk, which I'm not accompanied to do it. Good afternoon, thanks for coming. I'm Jim Cavallaro. I run the Stanford Human Rights Center with Corette and my colleague. So we have Professor Dr. Novak here today and others. Thank you all for coming. Let me tell you a bit about Justine Nolan, and then we'll get right into her talk. She's a senior lecturer at the University of New South Wales and deputy director of the Australian Human Rights Center. She has published widely on human rights issues, in particular corporate responsibility. She is also the author of the International Law of Human Rights, Oxford University Press, 2011. Teaches in the fields of human rights law, development, globalization, business, and human rights. She's an editor of 2 major journals. She is right now, despite her presence here, a visiting scholar at the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. Of course, why would anyone at NYU prefer to be in California, here in Stanford? Let me just note that there's been a significant expression of interest from students in the field of human rights, in particular in areas of corporate social responsibility, and we were very happy to be able to take advantage of Professor Nolan's presence here to provide a forum for debate and discussion on these topics. I should just say one last word about Professor Nolan, that she served as the Director of Business and Human Rights at the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, which is now Human Rights First. She was also very involved in the creation of the Fair Labor Association and has worked with the United Nations on business and human rights initiatives for some time, both in public interest and in private practice. She's focused in this area. And I think it's fair to say that she has been at the cutting edge of the field of business and human rights before it was a field. So she really is someone who can speak with deep knowledge about the development of standards, practice, tensions, and the current challenges which she will address today. Her talk is on Beyond the UN Guiding Principles, strategies to improve corporate compliance with human rights. Topic obviously of great interest to all of us here and well beyond this room. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Nolan.
Thanks very much, Jim. What Jim diplomatically left off is that I went to Berkeley, so obviously I have an in-depth bias against Stanford, but he also went there, but he tries to keep that quiet. So let me just, before I start getting into the talk, Jim did give you a sense of my background in this, and I'll just elaborate a little bit more because it gives you a sense of my research and my focus, because my academic research is pretty pragmatically focused, which is not always popular in academic circles. We tend to like to write things that no one else is going to read. But I tend to try and look at how things can actually work for how might a company actually apply some of this theory. And the reason I come from that background is because, as Jim said, that I started off in this field in advocacy. I worked for an NGO in New York, and it was sort of the mid-90s when this field was just emerging. So there was starting to be stories about sweatshop horrors overseas. There was stories about Nike, using child labor or poisonous chemicals in their shoes. And American consumers and American students started to think, might this be a problem for us? Does it affect us? Should we get involved? And there was, in the mid to late 90s, there was a really strong interest on American campuses from students on this issue. And everyone was really excited because American students hadn't been excited about much for a long time, particularly in the protest ethos. And this evoked sit-ins on campus, at university offices, and they were protesting things like, you're using Nike for our college sweatshirts and Nike's using child labor to make them in Vietnam. And the students were really involved. And then you had a couple of high-profile celebrities who started to get pinpointed about their goods. One of the sort of well-known ones was Kathie Lee Gifford, who was on a morning show at that time, and she burst into tears when it was revealed her handbags were made with child labor in Honduras. And so it started to be an issue that connected with American consumers. There was a sweatshop discovered just outside of LA where there were about 200 Burmese women sort of basically working in a factory where they couldn't get out of the gates, and they slept there, worked there. And people started to think, well, it's not only happening overseas, and in that times it was Southeast Asia, it's happening in our backyard as well. And so the initial focus was a lot university sort of interest in it, but they targeted the big brand name companies. And at that time, Nike was the sort of the poster boy for the sweatshop movement. And I would say now that I think Nike is one of the most sort of progressive and advanced companies in this field in terms of governance. But in the mid-90s, it was scrambling. It didn't know what to do. And the initial focus in the mid-90s was on apparel and footwear companies, because they were largely producing offshore. So these companies originally, some of them had particularly Levi's, had factories in the US. They all moved them out basically in the 80s and early 90s, and mostly to Southeast Asia. Not so much China at that time. It was Vietnam, Indonesia, Cambodia, and then later on it moved to China. And obviously they were finding that they could make the goods at comparatively much cheaper prices. And there was all sorts of conditions, all sorts of problems with the working conditions. The other big focus for the industry was on the extractive and oil and gas sector. So you had issues exploding literally in Nigeria in particular, with Shell and BP, looking at the movement of the Ogoni people, looking at basically the use of their land and resources, and then getting nothing in return except exploitation. And so it was a change in the human rights movement from focusing on sort of states and governments to looking at business, and for the first time thinking, well, should business actually be responsible for this? Should they do something about it? And if they should, what should we do? And so one of the early things that I worked on was in the mid-90s was the Fair Labor Association. And this was an NGO that was started, initiated by President Clinton, who sort of pushed the warring sides together. And the warring sides at that stage were sort of companies and NGOs and trade unions. And then the student bodies came into it as well. And we would have initial meetings, and President Clinton was very interested in the issue, and he would send his economic advisor to the meetings. They would hold the meetings often in the White House. And so everybody sort of felt this obligation to at least talk. And people would mostly just yell at each other for a few hours. And in those days, it was a central issue to companies. So it wasn't, sometimes these days you find companies sort of being foisted down the chain in the company headquarters. Those days, Philip Knight of Nike would turn up to the meetings, or you'd have Nike's general counsel at the meetings. And so it was sort of the people who were making the big decisions in the company were involved in this issue because they felt like it was having such an impact on their company. And you had really sort of groups that really hadn't talked to each other at this point. The companies were not comfortable in the same room with the NGOs. They were definitely not comfortable in the same room with the unions. The NGOs and the unions were fighting amongst themselves, and the students were fighting with everybody. So we would sit in a boardroom, and there would be yelling for 3 or 4 hours while we were trying to hammer out a code of conduct. And then, it took 2 years of these sorts of conversations. And it was always interesting to me, one of the early meetings, and I hadn't been in the US that long at that point, and we got a call that there was a, sort of this meeting was going to be held and everybody had to turn up, and I was on the phone to the woman who was setting it up, and she said, this meeting's at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And I said, well, what's the cross street for that? And there was a sort of stunned silence, and she said, it's the big white building, the White House. I said, oh, I should be able to find that. No problem, no problem. But it was that sort of gung-ho mentality, bring everybody together, and the White House wasn't officially involved, but we'll have it here so you feel like you should have a result. And so I'll come back to these types of organisations like the Fair Labor Association, because there's new ones emerging. There's a new organisation emerging now around an international code of conduct for private military security providers. And it's basically where some of these issues were in apparel 20 years ago. They're now in that industry. In the middle time, it's been the internet industry, which has come up with its own sector. And so part of what I'm going to look at today is when we talk about sort of moving beyond the guiding principles, is looking at how sector by sector we're responding, and is that a right way to go? Is that an easier way for companies to do it? Because I think what's interesting in this field of human rights is that traditionally in human rights, we focus on the government. We talk about the state. It's the state responsibility to enforce human rights. And in this sector, you can talk about the state having a responsibility, but nothing will get done if that's all we're going to rely on. And so, because one of the principal players in this field are the companies. They're the one with pull, they're the one with influence, they're the one with money. And unless they're seen often as a joint stakeholder with the government, then there's not going to be improvement and action. And so one of the things that interests me is how do you change corporate culture to encourage corporate compliance? How do you make companies want to get involved in this issue and see it as a mainstream issue? And it is a mainstream issue for some sectors now, apparel in particular and footwear. But it's still an emerging sector for others, like the technology sector, the military sector. They're still seen as sort of, they're being forced into it, but they don't really want to do it. And so we're trying to figure out what lessons can be learned as we go along the way. So one way to sort of start this discussion is to look at and focus on what happened in Bangladesh as sort of this microcosm of disaster of corporate compliance with human rights. So 1 year ago last week, a 9-story building collapsed in the Rana Plaza in Dhaka in Bangladesh. And the photo on the left is around that day and the days after, when people were being pulled out of the building. So just over 1,100 garment workers died on this day when the building collapsed. So it was a 9-story building. It was originally should have been a 3-story building. The electrical power in Dhaka is really unreliable, so most of the factories all have their own generators. And as they add stories illegally to these factories, they add generators to the building. So this had the generators mostly on the top floor, and there started to be cracks in the building. The day before, the cracks started to emerge. Everybody had been sent out of the building. The next day, the workers turned up for work. The cracks were still there. The engineers had assessed conflicting opinions, safe to go in, not safe to go in. The owner of the factories ordered the workers in. And the workers felt like they were not in a position to say no. So they filed into the factory, and then later that day the building collapsed. So it housed multiple factories, and over 1,100 people died. And these factories were producing mostly for Western brands, European and US companies largely. And there were a lot of illegal sort of subcontracting factories going on here that some of these brands didn't know about their work that was being produced in there. So then this photo on the right was taken just a few weeks ago by a colleague of mine from NYU, going back to finish a report that we've been looking at. And so when you go to the site now, it's just a big series of rubble with lots of material all through it. Children dig through it, and just before they took this photo, some kids had found a whole pile of bones that we assume were people who had been killed from the year before in it. But it still sits there sort of as this rubble. There's no magical memorial like 9/11 that's going to take place in that place. So what's interesting when we look at Bangladesh is to look at how it's transformed and how this movement has or has not changed it. So in Bangladesh 30 years ago there were less than 400 garment factories. Today there's 4,000 to 5,000. Some people estimate 6,000. So originally it had about 120,000 workers in this sector in Bangladesh. Now there's 4 to 5 million Bangladesh workers working in the garment sector. It accounts for about 80% of Bangladesh's exports, and it's a major exporter to the US and Europe for garments. It's basically the go-to place nowadays for clothes to be made. It's the cheapest. The workers are the cheapest paid garment factories in the world, garment workers in the world. Their wages were increased just in the last year, but they're still paid, work very long hours and paid very little money. But most of these are migrants who've moved from the country to the city in search of a better life, and many of them argue that they do have a better life than what they left behind. And so partly it's a question sort of, for also the Bangladeshi government, but us and companies, to what extent do we have an obligation that the life they're living is okay, because it's better than the one they left behind, or is there any sort of obligation to at least meet basic rights in this sector? And a lot of what we're talking about here are labour rights and working conditions, so it's hours of work. There is child labour, but it doesn't tend to be extensive in a lot of these factories, but it definitely exists. That's one of those sensational media issues that is sort of rooted out early. But there are very long hours. So this woman here is a garment worker in one of the factories. So she's been working for 10 years in Dhaka in the garment sector, and this is her house. She lives in a basically 10x8 room with her 2 teenage children. Her husband was killed about 10 years ago, so she moved to Dhaka to get work. So after 10 years in the industry, she earns about $77 US a month, and she really doesn't have any prospect for sort of rising up the ranks in terms of this. Most of the supervisors, the line supervisors in these garment factories are all men. Women are the line workers, So since the Rana Plaza collapse happened, there was this sort of rash movement, if you like, to change the way things were done. The government set up a trust fund, which aimed to have $40 million. At the moment, it's got $15 million in it. One company, Primark, has paid $8 million into that fund. A number of companies who were present in Rana Plaza haven't paid at all. particularly American companies, because they see it as an admission of liability. More commonly, European companies have paid into the fund. The first payments were made to victims and victors' families just about a week ago of about $600 to the workers' families of the workers who were killed with that. So what happened in Bangladesh after was 3 initiatives started. There's sort of the Bangladesh Accord, the Alliance, and an ILO initiative, the International Labour Organization Initiative. And this is very typical of this movement in that basically there's splintering. When you think of how could we improve Bangladesh and do it efficiently, maybe we could set up one organisation where we could all work together and do monitoring and try and improve factory infrastructure. But the Europeans and the American companies largely split. They disagreed, on some of the substance. The Europeans think the American agreement is loose, not legally binding. The American companies are very fearful of some liability around these issues. The 2 initiatives are not that different. What they both are very ambiguous around is who's going to pay for company sort of factory infrastructure upgrades. The wording in both of the agreements is that money will be provided, but there's no obligations on the companies to do it, and it looks like it's going to fall on the factories. They don't have the money, so the factories continue to operate as they have in the past. But there has been some differences, and I think there has been some positive differences in the way that companies have reacted to Bangladesh, as opposed to sort of the last massive industrial accident about 30 years ago in Bhopal in India. In Bhopal in India, in 1984, there was a toxic gas explosion in a factory that was run by an Indian subsidiary, Union Carbide, but was owned by an American corporation. Union Carbide had over a 50% share in it. 3,000 people died immediately, and then if you read, say, an Amnesty research report on it, it would claim up to 10,000 people have died since. Thousands were injured, and then there's a history of birth defects, miscarriages in the area after Bhopal. Now, the immediate reaction after Bhopal in 1984 was denial from the corporate sector, and it wasn't really seen as a corporate responsibility. It was seen, well, legally, there's some grey area here. The parent corporation in the US, who is the one we'd want to hold accountable, could they show they had effective control over the company? There were a number of lawsuits which sort of all settled. The US lawsuit was sent back to India, and then it settled for about $340 million. But it was all focused on the legality of the connection. Could we link Union Carbide America to this factory? And it was always going to be difficult, but you could show control there. Now, the interesting thing to me is when after the Rana Plaza happened, the discussion wasn't around the legal connection of Gap or Walmart or Primark or H&M to Rana Plaza. It was just, you work in that area, you've got to have some level of responsibility here. And that's how the conversation has changed in the last sort of 30 years, which is very interesting. Now, companies were still obviously fighting how much they might be involved, whether they were going to be legally liable, but a number of them stepped straight up and said, yeah, we've got to figure this out, we've got to pay for workers while they're off, and stepped into this sort of area of responsibility, if not legal responsibility. And I think what's interesting in this area is that it's a real mix of legal and non-legal skills that are needed. A lot of it around it is advocacy, because there's not a lot of law around this. There's international human rights law, but international human rights law focus on governments. And if we're trying to get companies involved, it's hard, and there's academic arguments around it, but international human rights law indirectly rather than directly links to non-state actors like corporations. Now, you'll see academic arguments both ways about there is a link, there's a direct or indirect, but the greater consensus is largely that it's an indirect link. And so you can't look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and say, well, we could hold Gap liable under that. So we could look at a country signatory and say, yes, there's a connection, but you can't do that in relation to companies. And so the interesting thing in this field is trying to figure out the relevance of international human rights norms and labour rights norms and apply them to companies. And what we've seen is basically this mix of willingness and shifting companies' reactions into how willing they are to apply those norms to themselves. So in 2011, we basically had the UN develop what calls the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Professor Ruggie from Harvard Law School was the UN Special Representative on Business and Human Rights from 2005 to 2011. And ultimately what he presented to the UN Human Rights Council was this document on the guiding principles. And what he was very successful at was basically developing a political consensus among NGOs, unions, companies, governments, that something needed to be done. Now, whether it was actually going to be in the form of an international legally binding document, there was no consensus on that. But what he did do was develop political consensus around the notion that companies have a responsibility to respect human rights. So it's a very clear difference in language from the first sort of limb of his guiding principles, which says that states have a duty to protect human rights. So if you're human rights lawyers, you know that when we say states have a duty, we're looking at this legally binding connection between the state and the human right norm or the treaty. So when we move to the next area where we say companies have a responsibility, it starts to get a little bit more wishy-washy, and it's not grounded in law. He says it's grounded in societal expectation, that that's what we expect of our companies. And I think the problem in part with that is that societal expectation sometimes differs a little from company to company and country to country. I don't think that's me. And so what we have now is this sort of the UN guiding principles, which is like this motherhood statement, talking about here's a basic responsibility to respect, and this is what companies should do in relation to this, but it doesn't give specifics. So, is that something I need to answer? I don't know what's ringing. Go off eventually? I don't see anything ringing.
Maybe somebody forgot our phone. Is it the
It is me. You know what that is? That's my reminder.
So Jeff, you want to talk now?
Yeah. No, to pick up my daughter from school. Somebody else is doing it. Because they finish early on Wednesdays and I never remember and I've left her at school. Which is not a fair human rights thing to do. So prior to Ruggie's formulation of the guiding principles, there were all these sort of law and non-law that preceded it, what we call soft law, sort of in this area. So the UN norms, which was basically a more radical version of trying to develop almost like a treaty that would draw corporations in. And there was sort of softer version, something called the UN Global Compact, which the United Nations developed, where it asks companies to embrace and support and enact human rights. And it's you know, makes companies, it's sort of an educative tool, makes companies feel good, sometimes changes behaviour. It's a learning platform for companies. The ILO, the OECD had also developed their own instruments that sort of talk directly to companies, which was quite radical, but there was not an accountability link with any of these. And the UN Guiding Principles is the same. It sets out sort of a principles. It doesn't set out any method of accountability for companies in the sector. But what we've got in the last 30 years is basically an understanding that companies have some level of responsibility. We haven't got to the stage of making it necessarily a legal responsibility, but it's harder for companies reputationally to walk away. So then obviously, of course, that leaves a bit of a gap in sometimes. It's easier to target companies that are brand names, and particularly in some sectors. It has been traditionally harder to target companies like Walmart, for instance. Now they have a very strong brand, but initially what they buy on is basically price. And so they're always looking for factories with sort of where the cheapest goods can be made. Now, if you contrast a Walmart to a Gap type of thing, reputation is everything to Gap. And so they tended to be, those brand name companies tend to be far more proactive. Not to say that Walmart has not now embraced this issue, but sort of kicking and streaming mostly with it. So you have this sort of, you know, all of these initiatives around, and that's at a high level, sort of UN, ILO, etc. But while this was going on, basically the companies, NGOs and unions sort of went off and started to work in it themselves. And this is just a selection of some of the initiatives that are out there in this field. And you can see the difference sort of going from 1993 to now, that what this approach is, and these are all what we call multi-stakeholder organisations. So they would traditionally involve companies, sometimes unions, generally always NGOs, and sometimes governments, depending on the sector. So the early interest was in environmental organisations. So the Forest Stewardship Council, the Marine Stewardship Council, the environmental movement in this sector was sort of far more advanced in many ways than the human rights sector. Human rights has been playing catch up. But then if you look at that middle section, you'll see the Fair Labour Association, the Ethical Trading Initiative, the Clean Clothes Campaign. That was sort of the epicentre of the movement on brand name apparel and footwear companies. And so some are European-based, some are American-based, but what they sought to do was to get companies to sit down at the table with NGOs and unions, and again, some were there, some were not, and basically hammer out, how does this work on the ground? Like, if we're going into a factory, what sort of standards are we going to apply? So if you go into, say, a footwear factory in China these days, and footwear factories tend to be bigger than apparel factories, so footwear factories, you know, could be 10,000, 20,000 people, sometimes more, working on different lines. And you go in and they're all different lines. So there'll be a Nike line, there'll be a Reebok line, Adidas line, etc. And when we first started this discussion, the companies were very wary of talking to each other, because they all said, you know, we've got trade secrets, we, you know, have very specific specifications about our lines, and I'm thinking, they're all just shoes with different, you know, brands on them, and all the workers are doing the same thing. They all know what's going on. And initially what happened when you went into some of these particularly Chinese factories is that each company in the mid-90s started to develop its own code of conduct. So it would go in and it would stick the code on the wall. So the workers knew this is the Nike code. Now the first time they stuck them up, they just put them in English, which is obviously going to be a problem in China and most of the other South Asian countries. And then they realised they had to put in the local language. So then what they decided was, why have we got 20 codes on the wall? Maybe we come together and have one code. So these types of organisations aim to do that. They basically tried to get the big corporations around the table. Let's come up with a common set of standards that stem from internationally formulated human rights and labour rights. Try and sort of bear it down to the bare bones, put it in the document, and then set up a system for how we're going to monitor this. So the focus in the mid-90s and early 2000s was drafting codes of conduct, then setting up a monitoring and reporting system. So, you know, Nike suppliers, would have about 10,000, could have up to sort of 8,000, 10,000 suppliers around the world. And so a monitoring system might monitor 5% of those. So any monitoring or, you know, reporting system that you see, any of these, very few of them monitor more than 5% of factories. And so they're trying to get a selection of what's going on. And so what they were trying to do is basically build a system of efficiency. And this was the process I was involved in the mid-90s, and it was very conflict-driven. None of the companies wanted to be there. Nobody agreed that, you know, international labour rights really applied to Nike. They couldn't see why that would be. But what we've seen over the last sort of 20 years is a real turnaround in attitude, saying that international human rights standards and labour rights standards are applicable to companies. We just don't have that explicit legal connection, but they're the standards we go from. And that's basically what Ruggie did with the guiding principles, is that he said, you know, the standards to apply are international human rights standards. But then we have the understanding that is basically if a company looks at, you know, there's an international human right to work, just say, you know, the right to work, and you look at some of the sort of small specifics around that, some companies that doesn't mean a lot. You've got to translate that language into sort of more user-friendly language to some of these companies. And that's what these processes started to do. Then you had a whole new set of initiatives starting in the 2000s, particularly focusing on the extractive sector. The voluntary principles on security and human rights is still spluttering along. It involves governments basically sitting at the table, because a lot of extractive products, processes, companies partner with governments in joint ventures. So if, you know, Shell's going into Nigeria, usually the Nigerian government has a big piece of that joint venture. And so it makes more interest in that, sensible in that sector to have governments at the table. Then the Global Network Initiative is basically focused on freedom of information and the right to privacy, and it really targeted the information communications technology and the internet companies. And so at that stage it was targeting Yahoo, Google, now sort of Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, etc. But it basically grew out of a lawsuit that was brought against Yahoo, when Yahoo was had to give information about a user in China, and Yahoo Hong Kong was asked for this information, gave the information. The user, who was a Chinese sort of self-employed journalist, was found by the Chinese government and then put in prison and tortured and sentenced to 10 years in prison because he had released information via Yahoo about a government circular. And so there was a backlash against Yahoo. And so the companies in that sector thought, well, how do we come together to talk about this? And what was interesting, in 2007, there was exactly the same resistance from the information and communication sector as there had been from the apparel companies 10 years. It was like they hadn't seen what was going on outside their own window. And now the interesting thing is this new code of conduct and organisation is being drafted for private security providers. And the code of conduct was only formally sort of released last year. It's already had over 200 private security providers sign on to it. And because at this moment signing on doesn't mean a lot, because the organisation hasn't figured out how are we going to monitor, how are we going to report, but what they're trying to do is develop a code of conduct and standard for these types of organisations. So there's been this sort of continual development in this field, but this is all what we'd sort of call soft law. You can't look at it and say, well, the company is breaching the voluntary principles and so we're going to sue you. Now that has been tried, obviously in America, but it's had a lot of mixed success because it's not like a legally binding thing. Now companies could make these legally binding by putting them in their contracts, in their sourcing contracts, but that's been, that hasn't tended to happen. So what's interesting in this process is basically what we're seeing is what I refer to as like re-regulation. So basically states, non-state sector, companies, unions, NGOs, basically seeing that they're combining in order to deliver a public good. So the public good, say in Bangladesh, might be factory inspections, improving working conditions, figuring out what the new wage standards are. And what you're seeing is this real intermix between public and private, that these things aren't worked out by the government and then implemented, that a lot of the regulatory burden is being taken by the non-state sector. So, you know, NGOs and companies, basically, and unions doing this type of work. And it's interesting to see this sort of re-regulatory process. And one of the things I'm trying to look at the moment is saying, how effective is this? So we've got something like the Guiding Principles, which is a, you know, I would say a useful motherhood statement in this area and has got companies' attention, but it doesn't give corporate guidance on what you should do. And what these standards are trying to do is move some of this human rights language into specifics. So I was speaking just a couple of weeks ago with a professor who's here at Stanford, and he's done a lot of work in supply chain, in particular with Apple. And he was saying that he's looking at one company, one factory in China, where they basically have to hire 400 to 500 new line workers a day because of their attrition rate. So it's a 40, 60,000 person factory that's producing for Apple. Apple obviously doesn't own it, it's a Foxconn factory. But 400 to 500 people they lose each day. And so we were talking about, you know, one of the things they're looking about is, well, why are they all leaving? Sometimes they're leaving because the work is so boring, you know, and so one of the things that you might put in place is instead of a worker working on one part of the line each day, literally putting a screw into a phone, then you circulate them around 2 or 3 so they develop a bit more of expertise. Sometimes they leave because they're working too much. Sometimes the working conditions are, you know, are bad. Sometimes they leave because they're not working enough. That with some of the downside of it has been that there's been a crackdown on hours and overtime, and some workers want more money. And, you know, they go to another factory with it. So these types of issues are sort of hammered out a lot of time in these types of organisations. Or some companies, particularly say the size of Apple, are basically building up their own team to work on it together. And, you know, in this movement, what we found is that the more a company closes in, and Apple is not doing this, they've brought in, you know, outsiders to advise them in this. But in the early days, what companies did was basically shut the doors and say, trust us, we'll figure it out. And some of the media companies, particularly the young technology companies, are doing exactly the same thing now. They're saying, well, you know, we've got 40 people, we're busy trying to take over the world, we don't have time for human rights, but we'll figure it out, just trust us. And clearly that hasn't been really going too well in the privacy sector. And so people are starting to figure out that we can be more efficient if we talk together. So now you go to sort of a, you know, there was recently a conference in San Francisco, RightsCon, which dealt with human rights in the internet. And there were, you know, multiple internet companies there all talking about, to each other and to other NGOs, how do we monitor these sort of practices? How do we figure out, you know, where and why the internet's being closed in, you know, Kazakhstan, and what can we do about it? That type of thing. And so it's been a big change. But I think there's a lot of challenges in this sector. And I think I'll finish here so we can have more of a discussion about it. And one of the challenges is basically around this issue of control. So if we go back to the Bangladesh example, these again were photos taken by one of my colleagues. The top left, if you can basically see, is a small subcontracting factory in Dhaka. So this factory was set up in this guy's front yard. It employs 110 workers, and it's a subcontracting factory. So even if, you had H&M contracting with a bigger factory in Dhaka, what happens is they can't fill the order, or they want it quicker, or they want more, so they send it out. And they literally send it out, the material on the back of a bicycle. This is how everything's happening in Dhaka. And so they take the material over to these unregulated, sort of unknown factories. And this is what was happening in Rana Plaza. A lot of these factories were subcontracting factories. So it's not just sort of picking on brand companies and saying, you're not doing what you should do. Sometimes they literally don't know. And you could say, well, they've been put on notice, now they need to know. But it's really difficult, this notion of indirect sourcing and subcontracting in this area. And part of it comes from the brands themselves. Because they put in an order for 500 shirts, they realise they're selling well. This mentality we have of fast fashion, which basically means we see something, on a celebrity, we want it the next day, it sells well, so we want 500 more. So the order then goes back to the factory saying we want 500 more. So the factory can't fill that order, the workers might be even working to maximum, they send it out. And it's this process of basically trying to figure out how do you improve the supply chain. So it's looking at government regulation, like better monitoring of factories, which is very lax in Bangladesh. It's looking at how do you make companies link their supply chain and sourcing with the way it impacts workers' rights, and how they're ordering and their process for ordering affects the rights of the people who are making their good. It's connecting it with consumers. This idea that, if an new iPhone comes out, we want we want to have access to it. We see a dress, we want it now. That we have to wait for it. That the idea that if we're buying a shirt that's $10, we must have some notion that the conditions in which it's made can't be that great if we're paying $10 at this end. The price of clothing has decreased consistently over the last 20 years. And it's also coming faster and faster. And so the whole essence of supply chain sort of needs to be re-regulated in a sense. And the way it's only going to happen is when all these parties are talking together, which they're starting to do now. And this last picture is basically where they sell the excess goods. So when you go to particularly Asia or Southeast Asia or China, you can always buy the cheap jeans, or they sort of tell you they're the knockoffs. Sometimes they're the genuine article. They just got left over from the factory. And they're going out, they just didn't go out. Or sometimes these factories make 100 extra and then sell it on the street. So I don't know whether that makes you feel better that you can buy the $10 jeans in Dhaka or not. But a lot of the time it's not a sort of off product, it's the genuine product. So there's all these types of factors, and I think what's interesting in this area, to finish off, is to basically, there's no real rules of the game. There's overarching rules, we see human rights standards, we have motherhood statements, we have sort of down to the specifics of the company, but there's nothing that we can look at and say, okay, you're doing that wrong, here's how you do it. Everybody is trying different methods. And one of the things I'm interested in looking at is these multi-stake organisations to say, are they changing the way companies work? And in some sectors I think they are, but could they be more efficient? How could they spread? And can you replicate it in different places? If you've got a program that works in Cambodia, which the Human Rights Clinic did a report on last year, can that be replicated somewhere else? And what factors do you pull out to make that work? So I might stop there, and so we can, if there's any questions, we can chat.
So we're just going to open into questions.
Yeah.
The different organizations that you talked about, you said it seems like it's coming a bit in waves according to different industries. Are there specific things that you feel like seem pretty obvious that could be learned from some of the previous waves?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because basically each time these organisations start up, they reinvent the wheel. So when the Global Network Initiative started up, there was a lot of, they were trying to figure out governance issues. So how many, what should be the division of the board between companies and NGOs or unions, etc. So I think governance issues are very replicable. So what might work or not work in another organisation, you should be able to transfer it. How many, what's the division between this multi-stakeholder type issues? Accountability mechanisms are something else I think that can be learned from. That the initial focus of all these types of organisations was on monitoring. So let's set up a code and then let's just keep going back into the factory and see if it's working or not working. And what they're showing is that basically monitoring is a tool, but it's not the answer. If they're monitoring 5% of 10,000 factories, you're not going to get consistent results. And obviously, a lot of these factories are very well versed in basically rigging the game. I mean, one factory I went to many years ago, it was a factory maybe about twice the size of this room, so a small garment factory. So garment factories don't need infrastructure, it's just showing machines and piles of material. And it was pretty well lit, you know, I don't think there were any windows, but you know, it was reasonably fine, there wasn't any obvious fire hazards. And it was only when we left later that day and then we went back after someone told us, there was an entire fake wall. So the real factory was behind, you know, what looked like a completely solid wall. And so in the same space, there was double the amount, you know, of machines and people and material, etc. So sometimes in garment factories, you have classic fire hazards because as the goods are waiting to be made, there's just mounds, you know, up to the ceiling of jeans or material that's going to be made into jeans. And so factories are really good at rigging the rules. It's very common to have two sets of books. You know, one that they show the Western auditors or the local auditors, and another one that they show, you know, others. So monitoring is part of what you do because I think you've got to get information and build transparency in it. But basically, the longer term solution I think is to work with the companies at the source. So trying to figure out how you put orders in, do better risk assessments. If you're going to, you know, be working in Nigeria, let's figure out what a standard human rights risk assessment. So obviously human rights risk assessment as a tool have been around for some time, but applying it to the corporate world is a relatively new thing as well. So I think there's lots of lessons to be learned, but one of the things I'm seeing is that people don't have time. You know, it's like when the sort of internet companies started on this, everybody was like, oh my God, we've got to fix this now. You know, there's a guy in prison in China and he went there because of Yahoo. How do we fix this now? And they don't have time to look at an organisation that did it before. The newest one, the International Code of Conduct of Private Military Security Providers, they've just appointed an executive director who basically one of the first things he's doing is trying to do a study of what people have done before him in other areas. And so I think they are learning, but there's not like a book you can go to or a blog you can go to even. I mean, that would be a good future project, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned supply chain, but I was thinking in terms of that expression about the raw materials, for example. So if you're making garments, where does the material come from, and do corporations have any responsibility for monitoring what goes on in that part of the supply chain, or even transportation for that matter, after the products are made,
yeah,
you know, and so forth. So there's a whole supply chain in a normal sense.
Yeah, it is, and that is basically the company very rarely, no, they're not focusing on that aspect of it. There's other NGOs and unions focusing on that, and it tends to be then just focused on the agricultural industry and where the cotton is grown. But for instance, in Bangladesh, most of their raw materials are coming from elsewhere, not being sourced in Bangladesh. And so when a company is contracting with a particular factory, they're not putting in any provisions of, you know, where things are coming from. They're basically looking at the assembly of the pair of jeans. But everything, you know, a pair of jeans in Dhaka, mostly everything is coming from outside. So they're basically...
The question is, does a corporation have any responsibility to track that down and see if there are any problems there?
No, what they're doing at the moment, and that's the next frontier, if you like, but what they're doing at the moment is focusing on those particular companies, like big Western companies that might be, you know, focused on cotton or other raw materials. But a lot of the time, in this area in particular, it's little local companies where all these goods are coming from. And so that's a whole nother, you know, there's basically some frontiers that are not explored. That's one, like the source of the material. The other is particularly the informal sector. In some places, I mean, it's easier to monitor and improve factory conditions, but a significant proportion of work is also done as homework. So that because of this overflow of orders, women take the work home. And so then, you know, they do overtime work at home, or they get the kids to help them with it. So for instance, you know, in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, there was a big outcry about the production of soccer balls in Sialkot in Pakistan. And it was right before the FIFA World Cup. And it was found that these soccer balls, 97% of the production of the world was coming from this one region in Pakistan. And it was all being, not all of it, but a significant proportion was being done by children at home. Soccer balls in particular are very, they say, children are, it's easier for children to work on them, particularly the final sewing of it. And so the question was, you know, the companies that were using these balls, and FIFA as well, what level of responsibility was there. There was a whole program set up, and one of the initial movements was basically to move all the homework into a factory. But then that created obviously its own problem, that many women then couldn't work because the children, what was happening to the children? So then sometimes the children came into the factory. So then the next phase was, let's set up a fund to get the children to go to school. So there's very rarely a simple solution, in this area. You sort of, well, let's solve that problem, and you create the next problem. So what initially happened is that it drove a lot of children into worse conditions of work. So they went to work for brick factories. They went to work into mines because they needed to earn an income, and they weren't getting it from sewing soccer balls. So there were then various iterations of this program which tried to address these. Each time they made a change, then they found another problem. But it is that there's always another frontier, and that, that's a good question, that the source of material is focused on by some, particularly Oxfam has produced some really interesting reports in this area. But it's almost like we haven't got to that yet. But there are particular organisations focused on the sourcing of products.
You talked about the difference between global ultimate reaction and Rana Plaza, and that the way companies responded was good. And I feel like it can also be seen in a more cynical light of how before there was a question of whether or not they may or may not be legally responsible, and the companies were very aggressively opposing it. And now it's almost like they're doing other things and paying more attention to a different argument so as to just not deal with that.
Yeah.
Almost in the sense of they think they aren't legally responsible, but also trying to
But we're doing good.
exactly move the ball.
Yeah. I think
so
that's a fair point.
So yeah, on the legally responsible front, what should be done?
So,
or should we play their game and try and, I don't know, snag them eventually in some way?
So one of the big differences, which you rightly point out in relation to Bhopal and Bangladesh, was the transmission of images from Rana Plaza. So in 30 years, 30 years ago, there wasn't someone taking pictures on a mobile phone and transmitting them or putting them on Twitter. And so Bhopal happened, and it was really the Time magazine cover which was up there, which happened sometime later, saying 3,000 people have died here. We need to take some notice. Rana Plaza, if you go back and look at the news feed, within that first hour, everywhere. AP was all over it. There was Twitter was on it. There was everybody. You could get pictures, and you could get those horrible pictures of, the classic photo of the very one. I think actually I left it out because it was too awful. Oh, there was one woman at the start. They found a man who was basically died in position, holding a female worker, basically trying to cover her, and they were like frozen, covered in dust. And that image was everywhere. Within an hour. So that was part of the company's reaction, because straight away it was like, we've got to address this. This is a PR nightmare. And at the same time, they could find labels in the dust saying, Primark, you're here. And there were a number of companies that came out and said, no, we won't, we don't. And they said, well, that was illegally subcontracted. And people were like, you're still there, so it's your responsibility. So on the legal terms, there's been a lot of movement in this area. There's been a lot of noise, I should say, and little substance. So there's a particular, the US has been a focus of this for some time. There's a particular, there's been litigation in the US focused around the Alien Torts Claims Act. There was obviously a big decision in 2013 with the US Supreme Court on the Kiobel case. And the Supreme Court basically, you've got more hopeful people, I would say, shut down that avenue of litigation. And it was never a sort of a constant stream of litigation, but it had the threat. It was the stick, if you like, for companies. And I think the Supreme Court pretty much took that away, other than in particular circumstances where it's a US company and perhaps on US soil. And so the legal movements are actually now more active in some other countries, and we've seen particularly in parts of in the UK, Belgium have had some interesting, in Canada, have had some interesting cases where they've looked at this notion of extraterritoriality in relation to human rights and saying, to what extent do human rights, we're responsible for human rights within, say, US territory and or jurisdiction, but beyond that, what applies. And some of these countries courts have taken a more expansive interpretation. You've seen the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights take quite an expansive interpretation in relation to this as well. But it hasn't fed into sort of legal liability yet. And so at the moment, you've got sporadic lawsuits, which gets attention, but the legal focus has moved more towards making companies mandatorily report on these issues. So the US, for example, the Dodd-Frank Act, which has just started operation, looks at companies, the SEC requires companies who are sourcing conflict minerals from the DRC, the Congo, to basically disclose and say, we're doing this and this is what we're doing to mitigate the risk. So the focus on law at the moment has moved towards reporting. The EU has just set in place a directive which requires companies to expand on their non-financial reporting, which will be effective in July. And so in terms of lawsuits, there's not a lot of action, particularly in the US. And that, you've got that hurdle of making that legal connection where human rights traditionally talks to states. You've got a lot of people saying they don't talk to companies. And this is a very vibrant, active academic fight at the moment among academics and states and etc. There's a push also to have an international legally binding treaty on corporations. This push comes from corporations, not from corporations, from NGOs. Ecuador has taken it Ecuador has taken it under its stride. Basically, it was really strong before Professor Ruggie started his tenure, and he watered down that side of things. He said, no, that's not the way to go. So the movement is starting to revive itself, and Ecuador sort of put itself out there at the UN Human Rights Council this year saying we need this. I can't see it happening in my lifetime, because when you think about a human rights treaty, what it would do is speak directly to corporations. So transnational corporations estimated to be about 80,000, in the world, but that's the major, transnational corporations. What are they going to do? Front up to a human rights meeting and, have a discussion? One of the discussions might be that, and this has been raised before, is that you bring in corporations into the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court, and have them liable for the worst crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, etc. This was originally tried when the Rome Statute was drafted and was sidelined for further discussion. I think that's the more logical approach to start with, rather than a treaty on human rights focused on corporations, because I think that will just go nowhere with states. They're not hungry for more treaties. So there's all these avenues. I mean, the interesting thing about the legal liability aspect is that there's lots of different prods, but ultimately what you still come back to is looking at what can I do within a country's borders? Is there some piece of litigation, or is there something I can use, within Australia or within the US to capture that? And the big barrier at the moment is this notion of extraterritoriality, how much it transfers.
On that same issue, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership likely to include anything on this?
Yes. Oh, sorry.
Oh,
The Trans-Pacific.
Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
No.
No, you finish your question.
It was just tacked on to
Yeah.
the question she was talking about. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's all right.
That's it.
We'll come in. Manfred, do you want to go, and then we'll
It was actually also related
Okay.
to
them all together.
Sven. I would be somewhat less pessimistic than you. Also, your talk was about beyond the guiding principles. So, of course, everybody would acknowledge that Ruggie did a fairly good job in the sense of establishing a consensus, but at the same time watered down any kind of legal subcommission, draft norms, etc. On the other hand, there is, also within the Ruggie framework, they have the obligation to protect. That means states, and that means not only the host state, it's the home state now, primarily focused on. So to what extent does the home state really have to translate its international rights obligations towards companies? And of course, in many countries it does work, at least to some extent. But the second is also, you mentioned the private military and security companies. I mean, the code of conduct is the reaction of the West or the North to a fairly solid proposal of a draft convention on private military and security companies. So the idea would be more not to have a global treaty on all business and human rights, but more looking at the most kind of dangerous, sensitive, whatever, sectors, and then really develop a human rights treaty. And that, I think, it's a North-South conflict now, but I think it is something where you can get definitely a majority within the United Nations. As it's not just Ecuador. So.
But who's the majority?
I would think still in my lifetime.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, that's very positive coming from you, who are more immersed in the UN than almost anyone else in the last 10 years. But I might also put that to your European bias, that you're more sensitive to that issue than.
Perhaps I don't know, but I think most people would agree that just to rely on kind of non-binding code of conducts and corporate social responsibility because it's nice and whatever. So moving much more to also companies understand that it is a risk management tool.
Yeah.
And many companies also in the extractive sector do understand that if they comply with certain basic human rights standards, it's for them, it might become for them a win-win situation.
Yeah.
So that they're really managing the risk. And that's the message that I, at least in the companies I advise, I feel is more and more accepted.
Mm-hmm.
And if they accept that, then they might also accept certain binding obligations. So there are various developments. I mean, this whole idea of a World Code of Human Rights, where also you could hold companies directly accountable, is more and more discussed. So I would not be as pessimistic that that's something for the 27th
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think, because one of the points I guess where I'm leading to is I'm saying that you've got these various multi-stakeholder initiatives, but for me to see them to be truly effective, you've got to get the state involved in some way. It doesn't mean the state has to sit on the board of that initiative, but I think what it has to do is link a lot of the time that initiative with reporting requirements or a solid basis. And so that's where I'm seeing this process of sort of public-private regulation mixing, is that the state has to be involved in terms of legally obligating the company to do something. And it might be reporting or it might be other disclosures, and then that reinforces the multi-stakeholder initiative. And I think that's the process that's emerging now, as opposed to sort of some big global treaty. And that's where if home states can be more active. And you're seeing it in the EU, you're seeing it in some parts of South America as well. But what is interesting, I think, is also to look at and say, well, if you do have this, where are these companies located? And it's one of these things, who do we have to get on board to make changes? You have to get America, and you've got to get China, and some other aspects. And you can definitely start the process within the EU, because that's where any progressive human rights things start. And you have obviously a country like Norway, which is so far ahead in thinking with its pension fund and thinking in terms of protection of human rights and corporate obligations. But how do you get those? America is essentially the Walmart of this movement. Some time ago, and it's where you have so many big heads. But it's not just. It's also Southeast Asia has growing number of Fortune 500 companies, and this sort of business human rights CSR movement is really slow taking off in Southeast Asia. ASEAN has sort of started to look at this issue. It's very interesting, their approach. They tend to look at it as corporate social responsibility, they don't like to use the term human rights. They don't like to talk about any legal obligations. And they talk about a lot of fluff. Like if a company gets people to go out and paint a house for Habitat for Humanity, then that's what we're doing for human rights. That's great, you should do that. But that's not actually what we're talking about with legal obligations around human rights. So in this movement still, with being relatively young, there's this sort of schism between CSR fluff and then legal obligations. And we're sort of somewhere in the middle at the moment. And I agree with Manfred that there's not, I shouldn't be so pessimistic to say the gate is closed in that area. I think the gate is closed on a global treaty. I don't think, and I'm not sure that's the most effective way. But I do think there are lots of other ways that governments have to mandate responsibility for human rights. And I do think that in my lifetime we're going to see a change of thinking around extraterritorial obligations in relation to human rights. I think that's coming.
I think we have time for one more question, so maybe you can follow up the question we cut you off on. So.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, no, I asked it because I thought it fit into the question that this fellow over here had asked about international law, particular, or trade agreements in general, a way to implement this. And of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is the thing that's on the table today. Is that a possible venue for dealing with these things?
And it has been. Bilateral trade agreements have been used sporadically to deal with some of these issues. Obviously, the WTO and trade issues more generally are very reluctant in this area, and they don't see it as within there. And there's a whole another, sort of legal questions around the WTO and trade and human rights, etc. But that's a different sector. But the US, for example, has inserted labour rights standards into a number of trade agreements. Obviously, NAFTA, for better or worse, was one. But then separate agreements that have come later, Jordan, Cambodia is an excellent example. What the clinic looked at, where they basically, the sort of the garment quotas coming out of Cambodia to the US were linked with raises in standards in the factories, and that's a program that's ongoing in Cambodia. So it has been used sporadically. There's been a lot of resistance to doing it to some of the big movers. Obviously China, US has that discussion every year. But after Rana Plaza, President Obama basically changed some quotas in relation to Bangladesh, saying, you know, basically subsidies are off until you improve conditions in this. Got a lot of noise. It didn't actually affect the garment sector, but again, it was a move of strength, saying, we're watching, if you don't improve things, then it's going to affect your trade. And that, you know, that's a really interesting area. And there's, Professor Ruggie looked at that, and there are some interesting sort of papers that are up on the web around that. But it's also an underexploited area as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And